Thank you for singing.
Well, good morning. We're going to conclude our series, Fascinating Stories from Forgotten Lives. We've worked all the way across the back, and we're on our last person today, a gentleman named Mordecai. And this will be our last part in the series. This will be my last Sunday here for a while. We'll talk more about that later. But we've journeyed through this whole series, and now over the next few weeks, you're going to have a series of guest speakers while I take some time off and have a sabbatical. And I think that'll be really good for all of us. You don't want to hear me all the time. You get a change of pace, right? Had a professor tell me once, he said, if you eat steak for every meal, it kind of loses its specialness. And I told him, I said, no, I really like steak. I'll just take steak. The point is, like, variety's good, right? And so I hope you all enjoy that while I'm gone. And I'll enjoy my time and you will enjoy yours. We all kind of view situations differently, right? And typically, situations that are maybe bad or just not exactly what we desired, we can kind of see them through a certain lens, right? And there's a very wise man in my life that I'll talk to sometimes, and I'll be like, man, I have to do this, or I got to do that, or, like I'm annoyed with this, or, whatever it may be, right? And his response many times is, well, that sounds like an opportunity. And I'm like, I don't like this opportunity, right? Whatever it is, right? I'm like, I don't like this opportunity. I'm choosing to see this as a have to. And he's like, no, this is an opportunity. And today, I think we're going to learn about this guy named Mordecai, our 10th guy. And we're going to see that he thinks a lot like my wise friend, or my wise friend thinks a lot like Mordecai, whichever way, and less like me. Because Mordecai is a man of opportunity. He's a man that through this very difficult book of Esther, he sees opportunities everywhere to be faithful. And that's what he chooses to do. And that's what I want us to look and see. So if you want to turn to Esther, I'd encourage you to do so. Probably the easiest way is to go to the middle of your Bible, find the Psalms. And if you turn back left, you're going to see this really big book called Job, or Job, depending on how American you are. And Esther's the next book to the left. Okay, we're going to start right there. But we have to get kind of a setting for this, because as we've walked through each of these people, except for where I messed up that one week with Joe Nathan, you remember him? Except for that week, we've gone in order through the biblical story. And so we're now over here kind of at the end of the Old Testament story. And we've talked about David, and when we talked about David and the few folks surrounding him, the kingdom was united as one. And then last week, we talked about Naaman, and at that point, the kingdom had divided. And today, we are post-divide. We are in what's called the Exile Period. See, we've talked about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, right? And remember, the northern kingdom was incredibly consistent, but consistently unfaithful. Whereas the southern kingdom was more inconsistent, but at least they were faithful some of the time, right? And what happened between these two series of events, you remember Naaman, he was a Syrian soldier, right? Well, soon after that story last week, the Assyrians come in and take captive the northern kingdom. We call this the exile because we see this in retrospect now from God's perspective, that God was exiling them out when really in real time it felt like a takeover, a very ugly, gruesome takeover of the Assyrians, taking over the northern kingdom. And then after that, the Babylonians took over the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians came in and took over the southern kingdom. And then after that, the Persians came and took over the Babylonians. This is a very tumultuous time in history where the fiercest warrior wins. And we've had these changeovers several times, and now the Israelite people are no longer in Israel. They've been taken to these other places. And you can imagine If you were in some of these waves of how people were captured and taken away, that you've now experienced several different cultures maybe, where you were the culture to now you're not, to you're not again, and you're now once removed away. And each of the three, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, all treated captives differently. It actually got better every time, believe it or not. By the time the Babylonians and the Persians came along, the Jews were almost treated as normal citizens, where they could function in life. And you're going to see that today, because our picture today in the book of Esther is two people, Esther and Mordecai, who are Jewish, who have been taken as one of these captives, and we see kind of the role they have in society. And obviously it's an incredibly unique position. Not everyone was in their position, but we see to an extent some of the normalcy that was what it meant to be a Persian captive. The setting of this is in Persia. It's in the capital city of Susa. It's called, in the text here, we're going to see it called the Citadel. It's where the headquarters was, the palace and all this. There's a number of unique things about Esther, and I'd encourage you to go study the book of Esther on your own. I wrestled with how deep to dive into some of these uniquenesses, and I chose not to because I want us to focus on Mordecai, on the man, not on the book itself. But Esther is unique for really one significant reason. It is the only book of the Bible where God is never mentioned. Isn't that interesting? That God's book has a book within it that doesn't mention him. Now, I think there's a really intentional reason why here. Because if you put yourself in the shoes of Esther and Mordecai and the people of their time, it would be easy to be in the midst of this very tumultuous, inconvenient situation and to assume that God isn't with you. And you and I, we've all had these experiences, right? Where something really frustrating or terrible or tragic happens, and we ask ourselves, where is God? That surely God wouldn't allow this, right? And we start to have these doubts play out of God and his faithfulness and his goodness and his presence in the midst of this bad situation. And I believe that the author of Esther knew this. And that the author wanted to be particularly provocative, playing to that part of you and I who can tend to think that way. That in this story, in the midst of a situation that no Jew would ever want, right? None of us would ever want to be in their shoes. That it would be tempting for you and I, just like them, to assume that God wasn't there. And the reality is, if you go read in Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah and some of the other books written around this time period of Jewish history, the reality is that most Jews who were taken captive just simply assimilated into their new culture and walked away from their faith and their Jewish uniquenesses. That they almost took this posture of these tragic things have happened, God isn't with us, so I don't need to worry about him anymore. And so I'll go this way instead. And so I think the author of Esther is intentionally challenging us to read this whole story asking ourselves, where is God? And that's part of what I think makes Mordecai so intriguing. And this opportunistic mindset that he has is that in a story where God is never mentioned, it's clear that Mordecai knows God is present. And so as we read through here, I want us to be reading, looking for the opportunities, not the have-tos and the got-tos, right? So read like my wise friend, not me. Okay? So when we start the book of Esther, we start with this interesting story. The king, which there's a couple different names for this guy. One is Xerxes, and one is Ahasuerus. It's the same guy, by the way, okay? So the king decides to throw a humongous party, like a 180-day party. That's a party, okay? He throws this huge party, and it's for everybody. And we can tell from the context, this is a wild party, okay? Lots of all the things you would expect in a wild party, okay? And partway through the party, his wife decides she wants to throw a party for all the women of the kingdom. And so she throws a party too. And so we have this giant party happening in Persia. And at some point, the king calls for his wife, King Vashti, to be brought to him because he wants her to show off her beauty for all the men. Now, I want you to, don't church sterilize this, okay? What do you think is happening? We have a 180-day drunken party, and the queen is called to come show off her beauty. Okay, this book is not a pretty book in these ways. The queen refuses. You imagine that. The queen refuses the king's order. And so the king gets angry, and I'm sure in his drunken logic, he decides she should no longer be queen. I think she's actually fortunate he didn't just kill her. But he decides she shouldn't be queen any longer. And then he conspires with his wise men, which we all know how wise they are at this point in the whole process, right? And they decide that they should pass a new law, essentially forcing and obligating women to obey their husbands because they don't want the women of the kingdom to be looking to this queen as an example and rebel against all their husbands. This is not starting well, is it? And so that's what they do. That's chapter 1. We get to chapter 2, and in verse 5, we're introduced to our main characters, Mordecai and Esther. So chapter 2, verse 5, there happened to be a Jewish man in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. By the way, Mordecai was not his Jewish name. It was his Persian name, a name given to him after exile. So you think about his identity now is defined by something that is actually not of him. He was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem, that's the southern kingdom, with the captives who had been carried into exile with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had taken into exile. So that means he was taken into exile by Babylon and then later by Persia. So he's been taken captive twice. Now, he was acting as a guardian to Hadassah, that is Esther. So we have two different names for her. Again, change in names based on this change of captivity. The daughter of his uncle, for neither her father nor mother were taken alive. So he is the father figure for his cousin. Okay, if her dad was his uncle, they're cousins. The young woman was very attractive and beautiful in figure. When her father and mother had died, Mordecai had raised her as if she were his own daughter. So we see an opportunity here, don't we? Mordecai could have not raised her. But I picture that there may be a little age difference between these two. I picture that she may have been quite young when all of this turmoil happened because the normal kind of Jewish traditions of marriage at a pretty young age, especially for our cultural setting, like at 15, didn't happen. That these sort of things that I picture he's probably a little older, and when these unexpected events happened of exile, and we don't know whether she was in the same exile as him or a different one or what it may be, but he saw an opportunity to care for his cousin, to take her under his wing and to be her pseudo-father. Again, he didn't have to, right? But he chose to. He saw the opportunity to be faithful, to do what was right, not what was easiest. And I picture this, in our culture today, it'd be a very honorable thing. And many of you maybe have had this where maybe a sibling raised you or a family member raised you or you have done the same for somebody else, right? Super honorable, really important thing. But then I think about it in this culture where it's actually about survival because of their situation, right? And Mordecai took that on. He took that opportunity. He saw it as that, not as something he could just push off to the side and ignore. And so we finish chapter 2, and the king has a beauty contest. It's his way of finding a new wife. And so he has his servants go round up all the beautiful women of the kingdom. and has them brought before him. And in this section, we're not told whether Esther was rounded up, so to speak, kind of voluntold to go, or whether she volunteered, whether how it happened, we don't know, but somehow she gets put into the beauty contest. And as we find out, she makes the final cut. And as you're going to see at the end, she actually gets chosen to be the queen. And the text is important here because the text tells us in this section and several other sections that she has not revealed her heritage, that the king does not know that she's Jewish. That's going to play important in the story here. It may or may not have mattered to the king himself in terms of the choosing, but in terms of our story, it's going to matter. So she keeps that to herself. It's undisclosed. She spends 12 months in this process of this candidacy, if you will, where they went through kind of, it sounds like beauty treatments and to make sure they were purified and these women that were the finalists were worthy of being queen, so to speak. And so she goes through that process and she ultimately is chosen as the queen. And so now we have this unusual turn of circumstances, right? Where an exile, a refugee, somebody who has been taken captive is now queen of the kingdom. Now, don't think of that as she has any power. She doesn't, okay? But she's in this position. And so we come to chapter 2 and verse 21, and we see that Mordecai, he seems to have a new position. His position in life has changed. We're not told what it was before, but it appears that this is new, that this is a kind of a different place than he had before. In verse 21, we're told that in those days, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and there were these two eunuchs there, and they were all together part of the king's guard of protecting the entrance. And these two eunuchs, these two other men, became angry and were plotting to assassinate the king. And when Mordecai, in verse 22, learned of the conspiracy, he informed Queen Esther, his cousin, and Esther told the king on Mordecai's behalf. The king then had the matter investigated, and finding that it was true, the two conspirators were hung at the gallows. And it was recorded in the daily chronicles in the king's presence. That's going to be important later. Put that in your back pocket. So Mordecai, with this new position, he's in a place inside the gates where business happens in the kingdom, in the palace, and he happens to hear two of the other guys working there conspiring to assassinate him. He turns them in, so to speak. He passes the word on. They are punished, and he is the hero. But we're not told any more other than that. So here, think about this. He had an opportunity. Now, if you were captive to a king that wasn't your king, it would be quite easy to just let the guy be assassinated because he's not your king, right? He's the one who has you here against your will. But he didn't. He took the opportunity to be faithful, to do what was right. And so he saved the king. And we continue on in chapter 3, verse 1. Sometime later, the king promoted a man named Haman, exalting him and setting him in a new position above all the officials who were with him. He's the chief of staff. As a result, the king's servants who were at the king's gate were bowing and paying homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded. However, Mordecai did not bow, nor did he pay homage. So we have this situation where Haman is now promoted, and he is above Mordecai. He's Mordecai's boss. And there's this demand that when Haman comes in the room, you're going to bow. And in a very Daniel-esque way, if you've read the book of Daniel, Mordecai says no, and he doesn't bow down. As we're going to see, the king seems fairly unaware of this, even though it says it's the king's order. But Haman, this starts to really eat at him. And we've now been introduced to the foil, the contrast, the mirrored contrast image of Mordecai, this man named Haman. And so throughout the rest of that chapter of chapter 3, we get this sort of frustration that Haman has, that Mordecai would not bow down to him. This angers Haman, that he is not getting the respect that he believes he deserves. And he asks Mordecai, why will you not bow down? And Mordecai says it's because of his faith in God. He reveals his Jewishness, his Jewish faith, his convictions. And Haman, he decides to hatch this plot. Instead of just killing Mordecai, he thinks, well, if Mordecai is like all the Jews, instead of killing Mordecai, I'm just going to kill all the Jews. And so he goes to the king, and then in a sort of roundabout way, this roundabout story tells the king that there are these group of people who refuse to honor the king. And hey, king, if it would so please you, I would love to kill these people because they're not honoring you. And the king agrees and writes a law allowing that on a certain date, all the Jews will be killed who will not bow down to the king. So, chapter 4, verse 1, when Mordecai became aware of all that had been done, he tore his garments and put on sackcloth and ashes. We've heard this before in our series, haven't we? Tearing their clothes is anguish, right? And the sackcloth is clothing of mourning. And ashes and the dirt on the head is this idea of, I wish I were dead. Like I'm so grieved, I wish I were dead. That's his response. And he went out into the city crying out in a loud and bitter voice. But he went no further than the king's gate, because no one was permitted to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. Therefore, each and every province where the king's edict and law were announced, there was considerable mourning among the Jews, along with fasting, weeping, and sorrow. Sackcloth and ashes were characteristic of many. So he is being painted as this representative figure of all of them in the kingdom. When Esther's female attendants and her eunuchs came and informed her about Mordecai's behavior, the queen was overcome with anguish. Although she sent garments for Mordecai to put on so that he could remove his sackcloth, he would not accept them. She's trying to help by saying, put on different clothes. Come on, man. Pull it together. And so Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been placed at her service, and instructed him to find out the cause and a reason for Mordecai's behavior. Why has he gone crazy? And so he went to Mordecai at the plaza of the city in front of the king's gate. Then Mordecai related to him everything that had happened, and even the specific amount of money that Haman had offered to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to be destroyed. And he also gave him a handwritten copy of the law that had been disseminated in Susa for their destruction, so that he could show it to Esther and talk to her about it. He also gave instructions that she should go to the king to implore him to petition on the behalf of her people. So Hathach returned and related Mordecai's instructions to Esther. Okay, now, Mordecai is beside himself. And so let's not paint Mordecai to be a saint, right? Or to be flawless in this. As this happens, he very much is overwhelmed with emotion. Where he almost is like, I don't know what to do. And so I'm tearing, I'm sackcloth, I'm ashes, I'm just completely done in by this. I don't know how much time has passed in this little passage, but he, at some point, was able to pull himself together and to see the opportunity in the moment. Hey, Esther, I see this. You have to go to the king. Well, Esther replies, and she says, all the servants of the king and all the people of the king's provinces know that there is one law applicable to any man or woman who comes uninvited to the king into the inner court, and that person will be put to death unless the king extends his gold scepter, permitting him to be spared. I have not been invited to the king for 30 days. Esther says, I'm helpless. I can't just go marching into the king and say, well, this law is not right. And so Mordecai replies back. This is all going through the eunuch, right? I picture the eunuch going back and forth between the inner chambers and the outer. And Mordecai says, don't imagine, don't pretend that because you're part of the king's household, you will be the one Jew who will escape. If you keep quiet at this time, liberation and protection for the Jews will appear from a different source, while you and your father's household perish. It may very well be that you have achieved royal status for such a time as this. That's the famous line, isn't it, right there? What Mordecai is saying is, don't pretend that just because you're the queen, this isn't going to affect you. See, Mordecai sees the opportunity. And here's what I find interesting in what he told her. Did you notice this? He didn't say, if you don't, nobody will. That's not what he said. What he said is, if you don't, God will liberate and protect the people. But it will come at a cost, a greater cost. See, Mordecai has faith and confidence in God. Complete confidence that God will work, that God is present, that they have not been abandoned. He's just simply asking Esther, do you have enough faith to do this? The choice is yours. And each of us have that choice. I've heard people say, you're plan A and there's no plan B. No, there's a plan B. The question is, do you want to be a part of plan A? God is inviting you to be plan A. Do you want to, or do you want to forfeit it? Do you want to walk away out of fear, out of whatever reason, right? Do you want to be a part of it or not? And that's what he's asking her. And this is a weighty thing. I mean, put yourself in her shoes, right? This is no small ask that Mordecai is asking. And so her reply back, she says, go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast on my behalf. Don't eat, don't drink for 3 days, day or night. My female attendants and I will also fast in the same way. Afterward, I will go to the king, even though it violates the law. If I perish, I perish. She saw the opportunity, and she commits herself to do it. And so Mordecai, in verse 17, set out to do everything Esther had instructed him. And they go and fast. And she goes and it says she dresses herself up. She places herself strategically through a doorway so that the king might see her. And it works because the king says, why is she dressed up that way? And then somebody says, well, she wants to see you. And he invites her in. You see God working, right? And he invites her in. And she says, hey, king, I would love to have a banquet this afternoon for you and your right-hand man, Haman. And you know the king loves a good party, right? We've proven this already. He's like, count us in. And so later the afternoon, she's throwing a shindig for him. They're having a great time. I'm sure the wine is flowing. And she says, he asks her, hey, what's the purpose in this? She says, the purpose of this party is to invite you to the next one tomorrow. She knows the guy, doesn't she? One party's good, 2 parties are better. So tomorrow, we're going to have another one. And he and Haman are like, hot dog, yep, another party tomorrow. And so, they part their ways for the night. And Haman, we're told, he goes home and he's gloating to his wife about how awesome his life is and how he feels like the king. The problem is he's not the king. And in the midst of his gloating, and I picture this, if you've been around very many intoxicated people, you can see this happen where at some point they become fixated on something and they can't get off of it. He becomes fixated on Mordecai, on how awesome his life is, but there's this guy, Mordecai. He won't bow down to me. And his wife comes up with this brilliant idea. Why don't you build some gallows? And not just gallows, like extra tall gallows. And just hang the guy. Just be done with him. Now, there's actually some little bit of controversy in the text here, because the text says tree or stick idea, wood. And so there's the idea of, is it gallows, like we think of as a hangman's gallows, or is it more of an impaling stick, which actually was used quite effectively. If you go to Romania, I'd encourage you to visit the castle, the Bran Castle, that was the inspiration for the Dracula stories, because the real guy who lived in that castle was known as Vladimir the Impaler. He was quite good at keeping order in his kingdom by making people shish kebabs. And that could be what happened here. And so the wife is like, hey, you should build this really tall death instrument and put Mordecai on it. And Haman's like, that is a great idea. And so he heads back to the palace. And we go to chapter 6, verse 1. And it says, throughout that night, the king was unable to sleep. So somehow, some magical way, maybe God's interaction, the king can't sleep. He's got insomnia tonight. And he asks for the book containing the historical records to be brought to him to be read. He's a humble man. Just come read to me about all of my greatness, and that will soothe me and put me to sleep. He's not humble, right? And so they bring it, and they read it. And in verse 2, it was found written that Mordecai had disclosed that the two eunuchs who guarded the entrance, had plotted to assassinate the king. And the king asked, what great honor was bestowed on Mordecai because of this? The attendant said, nothing was done for him. The king said, who's that in the courtyard? Who's the guy out there wandering around at this time of night? Oh, it's Haman. He's coming to get permission to hang Mordecai. Do you see God at work? And so the king's like having the story read to him, and he's like, we need to do something for Mordecai. Who is that? Oh, it's Haman. Hey, Haman, come here. Since you're the chief of staff, come here. Come here, okay. So Haman comes inside. In verse 6, Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor? And Haman thought to himself, who is it that the king would want to honor more than me? Because I am his right-hand man, and I'm pretty awesome. So I'm sure the king's talking about me, right? And so Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king wishes to honor, let them bring royal attire, which the king himself has worn, and a horse which the king himself has ridden, one bearing the royal insignia, the logo. Then let the clothing in his horse be given to one of the king's noble officials, and let them clothe the man to the king's wishes to honor, or who the king wishes to honor, and let him lead him throughout the plaza of the city on the horse, calling before him, so it be done to this man whom the king wishes to honor. You see how Haman is really laying this on thick, thinking the king's talking about himself, right? The king said to Haman, that is an awesome idea. I love that idea. Go quickly, take the clothing of the horse, just as you described, and do as indicated to Mordecai. To Mordecai, the Jew. You picture Haman, like smoke, right? He went from like cloud 9 to the pit of anger, like that. You weren't talking about me? You're talking about that guy? I was just coming to try to get him hung. And so it finishes out with him doing exactly that, of him being paraded around by Haman. Mordecai sat at the king's gate while Haman hurried away to his home. This is verse 12, mournful with a veil over his head. Haman then related to his wife and to all the friends and everything that had happened, these wise men along with his wife, if indeed this Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is Jewish, you will not prevail against him. No, you will surely fall before him, because they understand the power of the God of the Jews. And while they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived, and they quickly brought Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And he's whisked away to this banquet, which I'm sure now he is not near as excited about as he was yesterday. And they're sitting at the banquet, and just like yesterday, the king says, Esther, why have you called us here? What do you have to ask of me? And it's interesting, he says, you can have as much as half the kingdom, just ask. She says, there's somebody in your kingdom who's trying to kill me. He's like, what? She says, yeah, he's trying to kill me. The king says, who is this guy? And she goes, him. Right? And the king is so mad, he runs out of the room. And Esther, I picture this like a little bit of satisfaction, right? She goes over and she sits on a couch, and Haman now suddenly isn't quite so top dog as he thought he was, comes and is begging her. And it says when the king walks back in the room that he's pleading for his life in this compromising position. And the king says, what, are you just going to rape her too? And he says, go hang him on the gallows he built. And Haman ends up on his gallows. And then we get to chapter 8, and it says, on the same day, the king gave the estate of Haman, the adversary to the Jews, to Queen Esther. So now all of these riches that Haman so loved and so was fawning over how awesome his life is, it's all hers. But Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had revealed how it was related to her. The king had removed his signet ring. And then Esther again spoke to the king, falling at his feet. She wept, begging him for mercy, that he might nullify the law that evil Haman had got him to do. And the king says to her, I can't undo something I did. She said, if the king, this is verse 5, is so inclined, if I have met with his approval, if the matter is agreeable to the king, and if I'm attractive to him, let the edict be written rescinding the recorded instructions of Haman, which he wrote in order to destroy the Jews who are throughout all the king's provinces. For how can I watch this calamity that it will befall my people, and how can I watch the destruction of my relatives? And the king replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai and said, look, I have already given Haman's estate to Esther, and Haman has been hung on the gallows because he took hostile action against the Jews. Now you write in the king's name whatever in your opinion is appropriate concerning the Jews, and seal it with the king's signet ring. Any decree that is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be rescinded. Get what just happened? The king gave the two of them the keys to the kingdom. That he's saying, I can't undo a law, but you can write a new law, and I'm trusting you to do it. Here's my ring, which is my authority. Go write a new law. And that's what they do. They write a new law. Now, this is an example of moral excellence, because the law they write is not exactly what one would say is appropriate. Because essentially they say on the same day the Jews were to be killed, the Jews can go kill. But the opportunity, remember, we're looking for the opportunities that Mordecai had to be faithful. So here, the king has handed him a blank piece of paper and said, write it. Write it with my authority. And they do. And the book ends with two more banquets, just like it began. They're very different banquets. After all of the bloodshed has happened, the Jews execute the law, They kill many people who had conspired against them. The king is pleased with justice and allows Mordecai and Esther and their whole family further freedom and elevates Mordecai again to a new position, Haman's position. That's how the book ends, the book of Esther. And so I said, we can enter into situations and we can see have tos and got tos and forced tos and don't want tos, or we can see opportunities. And I think about Mordecai. And I went back through and tried to identify all the opportunities he had to take a rather unpleasant situation, a really horrible situation, and be faithful with it. He had the opportunity to either orphan or raise his cousin. He had whatever his first position was in the kingdom, which I would guess with, even though we don't much about it, he was faithful with, based on how he was faithful with the others. And then he was elevated to a second position, which again, he was faithful with, including protecting the king. In a moment, he didn't have to, but he chose to. Then, when kind of things happened with the new law, he was faithful in understanding God's presence and God's will and God's plan here and encouraging Esther to be faithful. He was faithful in that. His response to Haman, as Haman confronted him and even came and attacked him and was plotting against him, his response was still faithful. He was elevated to his last position. His faithfulness before gave him an even greater position of influence, which I'm certain he was faithful with. He was entrusted with writing a new law. Like I say, whether how great or not we could call that law, he was faithful with what God gave him. God gave him the opportunity to rescue the Jewish people, and he did that in writing the new law. He was faithful. He saw these opportunities as opportunities to be faithful to God and what God was up to and inviting him into. Mordecai's confidence in God was unwavering. In a book where God is never mentioned, in a place where most Jews had decided God didn't exist, Mordecai knew he was there. And he lived his life operating faithfully, even in the midst of all the question marks. You and I, we go through those times too, don't we? They can be really hard times. Maybe they're short, a day or two, some small circumstance, but it hits hard. Or maybe it's an extended season. Can you imagine these guys? This story takes place more than 100 years after the initial exile. 100 years. Like, put that in perspective and go back to 1920, right? I mean, that's a while, right? To have this feeling of God's absence. And yet, like Mordecai, do we believe he's really absent? We sang a couple songs earlier. I didn't look closely enough, I have to admit. Two of those songs, the middle two songs, are two of my favorite songs. Because of this proclamation they make that God is faithful even when the rest of things are a disaster. And when everything else appears that he is absent, he is not. He is faithful and he is good. And even in the midst of the tragedy and the mess and the pain and the whatever else, he is there. And he is inviting us to be faithful. And so that is what I ask of us today. The question: do we believe God is present in the midst of difficult times? Because if we do, then we should be looking for the invitations. We should be looking for where God is working and how he is inviting us to participate in whatever it is he's doing. It doesn't mean it'll be easy, or pleasant, or fast, or that it's going to end tomorrow. But if we believe he's still there, and we believe that he is working, then we should be looking for his invitation and ready to respond, just like Mordecai did. And so let's pray together, please. Father, it's easy for us to sing songs like we did earlier, proclaiming your goodness, proclaiming your presence in all seasons. Father, it's another thing to believe that deep within our hearts when life isn't as it should be. When all the kind of tangible signs around us are that you're not present. You've forgotten. You've left us. Father, we know that's not true. And so, Father, I don't know where we're all at the moment. Maybe we're not in this place, but maybe some of us are. I pray that we are looking for you because we know that you're there. Father, I pray that we're confident in you. That even if the circumstances don't feel like it, you're present, you're faithful, you're true, you're loving, you're kind. And knowing that, we would seek you. And when we see these little invitations, whatever they may look like, this invitations for us to trust you in the midst of the appearance of absence, in the midst of the disaster, the struggle, I pray that we would. Father, that's really where our faith is tested. The crucible is in that moment where everything points away from being faithful, but you're inviting us to be. So, Father, I pray that we'd be faithful people as individuals and corporately, as a church. That would be us. And so, Father, as I'm going to be away from these folks for a while, I pray for your blessing upon them. I'll be excited to catch up in a couple months. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.